August 15th, 1945. Tokyo. Just before noon. Across the Japanese home islands, radios crackled to life in offices, factories, and private homes reduced to shadows by firebombing. The streets were quiet in a way they had not been for years. At precisely 12 o'clock, a sound emerged that no living Japanese citizen had ever heard before. The voice of the Emperor. High, formal, restrained, filtered through static and ritual language. It did not chant victory. It did not promise revenge. It did not name defeat. Yet every word carried the weight of an empire collapsing inward. For centuries, the Emperor of Japan had existed above speech. He was not a ruler who argued or persuaded. He was a living symbol, believed by many to be divine, issuing will through intermediaries, not breath. To hear him directly was unthinkable. To hear him concede was unimaginable. But on this day, imagination gave way to reality. Japan was ruined. More than 60 cities lay in ashes. Tokyo itself had burned in March, killing over 100,000 civilians in a single night. The Imperial Navy was shattered. The army bled across Asia and the Pacific, cut off, starving, still fighting wars already lost. Then, on August 6th, Hiroshima vanished. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Between those explosions, the Soviet Union declared war and surged into Manchuria with over 1 million troops. Now the Emperor spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, of endurance beyond endurance, of a war situation that had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The phrasing was ancient. The meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. Men wept openly in the streets. Soldiers stared at the ground, unable to reconcile obedience with annihilation. Some did not understand the language at all, but they understood the silence that followed. No call to arms came next, no imperial command for final resistance. Only the sound of inevitability. This moment had been resisted until the last possible hour. Many within Japan's military leadership had sworn never to accept surrender. Some still believed death was preferable to dishonor. Others believed the Emperor would never intervene directly. They were wrong. By speaking, Hirohito crossed a boundary that could never be restored. Authority was no longer abstract. Divinity had taken human form and admitted the unthinkable. To understand what Emperor Hirohito did on August 15, 1945, one must first understand what he was never meant to do. Hirohito ascended the chrysanthemum throne in December 1926, inheriting not merely a crown, but a cosmic role. Under Japan's imperial ideology, the emperor was the living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. He did not govern in the Western sense. He embodied the state. His existence conferred legitimacy on every law, every order, every war. And yet, Hirohito was no mythic figure behind palace screens. He was a trained marine biologist, meticulous, reserved, deeply conscious of precedent. He read reports obsessively. He annotated military briefings in his own hand. He knew the number of ships lost, divisions destroyed, oil reserves nearly gone. By 1945, the truth was unavoidable. Japan had entered the war in December 1941, believing speed and surprise could compensate for industrial inferiority. That illusion collapsed at midway in June 1942, when 4 aircraft carriers were lost in a single day. From there, the war became a slow hemorrhage. By late 1944, American submarines had strangled Japan's shipping lanes. Cities were exposed. The homeland was defenseless from the air. Still, the military refused to yield. The doctrine of Gaikisai, honorable annihilation, gripped the army leadership. They believed mass civilian sacrifice could force the Allies into a negotiated peace. Plans were drafted for Operation Ketsugo. Millions of civilians armed with bamboo spears, women and children trained to die for the emperor. Estimates projected up to 20 million Japanese dead if an invasion came. Hirohito knew this. Privately, he pressed his ministers with quiet, devastating questions. How long could the people endure? What would remain of the nation after such endurance? Each time the answers returned were wrapped in rhetoric, not reality. Then came Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., a single American bomber dropped a weapon unlike any in history. In an instant, approximately 70,000 people were killed. By year's end, that number would double. The city ceased to exist. Survivors described shadows burned into stone, skin peeling from living bodies, silence where sound should have been. Even then, the Supreme War Council deadlocked. 3 days later, Nagasaki burned. That same day, Soviet forces crossed into Manchuria, shattering Japan's last strategic hope that Moscow might broker peace. Within hours, the Kwantan Army, once Japan's pride, began collapsing under armored assault. The war was now militarily, politically, and morally untenable. On the night of August 9, Hirohito broke with tradition. He summoned the Supreme War Council and attended in person an extraordinary act. The generals argued. The admirals hesitated. The cabinet split evenly between surrender and continued war. Silence followed. Then the emperor spoke. "I desire that you give due consideration to the matter of ending the war," he said, "not as a god, not as an abstraction, as a man bearing responsibility no one else would claim." This was the moment the war truly ended, though many did not yet know it. August 14th, 1945, Tokyo. After midnight. The Imperial Palace lay in darkness, its gardens still scarred from earlier air raids. Inside, the machinery of surrender moved forward with agonizing slowness. Hirohito had made his decision. Japan would accept the Allied terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war would end, but the empire was not yet finished fighting itself. Throughout the capital, hardline officers of the Imperial Army believed surrender was treason. To them, the emperor's will had been misinterpreted, coerced, or corrupted by weak civilians. They convinced themselves that true loyalty required resistance, even against the throne. Major Kenji Hatanaka was among them. Young, fervent, and utterly convinced of his righteousness, he gathered a small group of officers and set a plan into motion. Their objective was simple and irreversible: seize the imperial palace, prevent the broadcast of the emperor's surrender, and force the nation into one final war of annihilation. Shortly after 1:02 a.m. they moved. Armed detachments infiltrated the palace grounds, assassinated the head of the Imperial Guard Division, and severed communications. The conspirators searched desperately for the phonograph recordings of the emperor's speech, 2 lacquered discs hidden somewhere within the palace. Without them, the surrender could still be stopped. Inside the palace, courtiers and officials hid the recordings in a safe, then in a chamberlain's office, then behind stacks of documents. Every minute stretched toward dawn. Every moment risked discovery. Hirohito remained secluded, protected by a handful of loyalists who understood what was at stake. This was no longer a question of war or peace. It was a question of whether the emperor's voice would be heard at all. By 4 a.m., confusion spread among the rebels. Orders they expected never came. Senior commanders refused to endorse the coup. The broader army did not rise. Loyalty fractured. As the sky began to pale, the reality set in. The coup had failed. Hatanaka, realizing the finality of the moment, distributed leaflets condemning surrender, then walked into the streets of Tokyo. At approximately 8 m, he shot himself. Others followed. Their deaths changed nothing. At 7:30 a.m., technicians arrived at NHK, Japan's national broadcaster. The recordings were delivered under armed guard. Engineers, many of whom had never heard the emperor's voice, prepared the equipment with trembling hands. Some wept openly, aware they were about to transmit something that would end the world they had known. Outside, rumors spread. Some believed the broadcast would call for a final stand. Others feared worse. At noon, the signal went live. The emperor spoke calmly, deliberately, without anger or regret. He did not accuse. He did not explain. He stated only that the continuation of the war would lead to the obliteration of the Japanese nation. This was the last barrier. Once spoken, it could not be retracted. Once heard, it could not be unheard. Japan's surrender was no longer a document. It was a voice. As the emperor's voice faded from the airwaves, Japan entered a moment without precedent. No decree followed, no clarifying command. only the echo of words that had dismantled the logic of sacrifice on which the empire had survived for decades. For the military leadership, the cost was immediate and personal. Field commanders across Asia received fragmented transmissions confirming what many had already suspected. Some obeyed at once, others delayed. A few refused entirely. On distant islands, units continued fighting for days, even weeks, unable or unwilling to accept that the emperor had chosen survival over honor, as they defined it. Within the capital, the cabinet moved quickly. Orders were issued to cease hostilities. Prisoners of war were told they would live. Ammunition dumps were sealed. Aircraft were grounded, and some burned on their runways to prevent unauthorized attacks. Hirohito retreated once more into silence, but the silence had changed. He had intervened directly in the machinery of the state, not as a distant symbol, but as the final authority. In doing so, he assumed responsibility for defeat, something no Japanese emperor had ever done. Privately, those close to him noted the toll. He slept little. He reviewed casualty estimates repeatedly. He asked about food supplies, about epidemics, about the fate of civilians in burned cities. His concern was no longer victory. It was preservation. Outside Japan, reactions were swift. In Washington, President Harry Truman addressed the nation, confirming Japan's acceptance of surrender. Allied commanders prepared for occupation, not invasion. Plans that had anticipated hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties were shelved overnight. In China, Korea, and across Southeast Asia, the Japanese empire collapsed almost instantly. Garrisons laid down arms. Collaborator regimes dissolved. Prison camps opened, revealing survivors skeletal and diseased, bearing witness to years of brutality that surrender could not erase. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives signed the formal instrument of surrender. The emperor was not present. His role had already been fulfilled. Yet even then, uncertainty lingered. What would become of an emperor who had admitted defeat? Could the throne survive exposure to human judgment? Many expected Hirohito to be tried as a war criminal. Others demanded the abolition of the monarchy itself. The Allied occupation authorities faced a choice as irreversible as the emperor's own. Remove him and risk chaos. Retain him and redefine him. They chose redefinition. Hirohito would remain, but no longer divine, no longer untouchable. He would become, for the first time in Japan's long history, a constitutional monarch whose authority derived not from heaven, but from law. The war had ended, but the transformation it unleashed was only beginning. January 1, 1946, Tokyo. On the first morning of the new year, Emperor Hirohito issued another statement. This time there was no war to end, no armies to command, no empire to preserve. There was only truth spoken plainly, without ritual protection. The emperor renounced his divinity. In carefully measured language, he declared that the bond between himself and the people did not rest on myth or divine descent, but on mutual trust. The words dismantled more than theology. They dismantled an entire worldview that had justified conquest, obedience, and sacrifice without question. For generations, the emperor had been an idea. Now he was a man. Japan, under Allied occupation, was remade with unprecedented speed. A new constitution stripped the throne of political power. The military was dissolved. Women were enfranchised. War was formally renounced. Authority shifted away from an unquestioned hierarchy toward law and accountability. Yet none of it would have been possible without August 15, 1945. That broadcast did more than end a war. It ended a conception of power that had survived for centuries. When Hirohito chose to speak, he accepted something no ruler had ever been expected to bear: the weight of defeat spoken aloud. There was no triumph in his voice, no appeal to glory, only endurance and responsibility. In later years, some would argue that he spoke too late, others that he should never have spoken at all. History would debate his culpability, his silence, his survival. But on that day in August, when words replaced armies, the outcome was settled. Empires often fall in blood. Japan fell into sound. A voice, once forbidden, crossed the airwaves and reached a nation in ruins. It did not save Japan from loss, it saved it from annihilation. And once spoken, it could not be undone.